Have you ever stopped and wondered how a historian can look at just two massive events? I mean, think like the French and Russian revolutions, and then make this huge argument about how all revolutions work? It sounds impossible, right? Drawing these giant conclusions from such a tiny sample size. Today, we're going to crack open the toolbox of comparative historians and look at the logical engine they use to do just that. It's a set of ideas called Mill's methods, and let me tell you, they are as powerful as they are controversial. All right, let's get into it.
So let's just get right to the heart of it. How can looking at just two revolutions possibly explain all of them? Well, the short answer is they can't. And you know what? That's not even the goal. The real power of this kind of research isn't about creating some universal law that applies to everything everywhere. No, it's about building a deeply detailed, rock-solid explanation for the specific cases you are studying. It's all about solving the puzzle that's right in front of you with some seriously sharp logic.
So here's our game plan. We'll start by looking at the tool itself. Then, we're going to put it on trial, with 4 major charges brought against it. We'll follow that up with a couple of rebuttals, get to the bottom of the real misunderstanding that fuels this whole debate, and finally, show you how to use these methods the right way. Yeah, you can think of it as a kind of intellectual courtroom drama.
Okay, first up, let's meet the tool. Researchers like the amazing sociologist Theda Skocpol use something called Mill's methods of agreement and difference. Now, the guy who came up with them, John Stuart Mill, he thought they could discover and prove causes. But here's the twist. Modern researchers use them for something much more specific, and honestly, way more powerful. The art of elimination.
This table shows the method of agreement in action. Just imagine P stands for social revolution, okay? So France is instance 1, Russia is instance 2. Now, both had a revolution, but their circumstances were really different. That's all the C2, C3, C4, and C5. But if they only share one key factor, which here is C1, let's say a specific kind of state collapse, then C1 becomes a prime suspect for the cause. The logic is actually pretty simple. If a factor isn't there every single time the outcome happens, then it can't be the cause.
Now, the other side of this coin is the method of difference, and it's just as logical. It basically says that to find a cause, you can't just look at where revolutions did happen. That's only half the story. You also have to look at similar places where they didn't happen and ask, okay, what was missing? If that one factor, that C1 from our last slide, is there when the revolution happens and it's gone when it doesn't, well, your case just got a whole lot stronger.
So here's the really crucial point. You don't use these methods to just magically discover a cause out of thin air. That's not how it works. In the real world, historians show up with a bunch of competing theories already in hand, from Marx, from Weber, you name it. They then use Mill's logic like a detective to test these theories against what actually happened. They can say, does theory A explain both France and Russia? No. Okay, then it's out. It's like a logical razor for just cutting away the bad explanations.
But as you can imagine, not everyone is sold on this. The sociologist Stanley Lieberson mounted this really powerful critique, arguing that when you're dealing with just a small number of cases, these methods are super flawed and can lead to totally wrong conclusions. He laid out 4 big charges against them.
All right, here are the 4 big charges. First, that they assume the world is deterministic. A always leads to B. And they ignore that history is often probabilistic, where A just increases the chance of B. Second, they supposedly can't handle interaction effects, where causes only work together, in combination. Third, they break down when an outcome has multiple separate causes. And finally, the killer, they demand perfect, error-free data, which, let's be honest, is a total fantasy in historical research. It's a pretty strong indictment.
So the defense begins. We're going to tackle the first 2 charges head-on, this idea that the methods can't handle probabilities or complex interactions. And this really gets to the soul of what this kind of research is even trying to do.
This slide gets right to the core of the misunderstanding. Lieberson's airline analogy says you can't judge a whole airline based on one bad flight. That's generalizing from a tiny sample. Totally fair. But historians aren't trying to review the entire airline. They're doing what Barrington Moore talked about. They're creating a detailed map of a specific continent. And that map is designed to help you fly over that continent, not the whole world. See the difference? The goal is a deep explanation of specific cases, not a shallow generalization about all of them.
Now, to make his point about interactions, Lieberson uses this clever car accident example. So in both cases, the driver was drunk and ran a red light. The only thing that's different is whether a car came from the right. The method of difference would look at this and seem to conclude that the car from right is the one and only cause. It completely misses the real story, that the accident was probably caused by the interaction of being drunk and running the light. This really looks like a knockout blow, right?
But it's not. Because in the real world, this is not how researchers use the method. Just look at Skutzpohl's own words here. She doesn't point to one single thing. She explicitly says that state breakdowns and peasant revolts, taken together, are what caused the revolutions. She used the method to isolate a causal recipe, an interaction effect. The method doesn't care how complex your cause is. Your cause can be one thing, or it can be a combination of 5 different things, all working together.
The defense rests. Just kidding. We're back for round 2. Now let's tackle those last 2 charges. The claim that these methods need perfect data and that they can't handle situations with multiple independent causes.
So this measurement error charge sounds really serious, but it kind of misses the whole point of qualitative research. See, in this kind of work, you're not just ticking boxes on a survey. Defining a really complex idea like state breakdown and then measuring if it happened in 18th century France, well, those are part of the same deep interpretive process. It's not some separate mechanical step where errors can just sneak in. The whole analysis is the measurement.
And what about multiple causes? The critique says the method fails because, car accidents can be caused by speeding, drunk driving, bad weather. But this is where being precise really matters. As philosophers pointed out a long time ago, when something seems to have a million different causes, it usually just means the thing itself is defined way too broadly. We don't just study car accidents in general, we study types of accidents. A skidding accident on an icy road has a very different and much more specific causal story than a head-on collision at an intersection. If you get specific about your outcome, that whole multiple causes problem tends to just melt away.
So we've gone through the charges, we've gone through the rebuttals, and now we get to the big reveal. The real root of this entire debate isn't some small detail. It's a fundamental difference in what people think the goal of research even is. It's a clash of 2 different worlds, studying cases versus studying variables.
So here it is, the whole thing in a nutshell. Case-oriented research, the kind that uses Mills methods, is all about explaining a specific outcome in all its glorious, messy detail. Its goal is to create that pilot's map we talked about. Variable-oriented research, what you see in a lot of statistical work, wants to find general patterns across hundreds or thousands of cases to generate the airline's on-time statistics. Lieberson's critique was basically judging a map-making tool by the standards of a statistics-generating tool. They're just designed for completely different jobs.
Okay, so knowing all that, how can we actually use these methods correctly and, avoid falling into those traps? Let's boil all this down into a practical guide for anyone who wants to start thinking like a comparative historian. Here it is, a 4-step process. First, start with a really clear puzzle. Why did a revolution happen here but fail over there? Second, and this is key, don't just have one pet theory. Come up with several competing explanations. Third, use the methods not to prove anything, but to eliminate the theories that just don't fit the facts of all your cases. And finally, what's left over becomes the foundation for your final, refined argument, which will almost certainly involve a complex combination of factors, just like Skutzpohl's did.
So, the verdict is in. The case against Mills' methods, at least in this context, really falls apart. They were accused of being a flawed machine for trying to create universal scientific laws from just a handful of examples. But that was never their job. Their real job, their true power, is to act as a logical lens, a tool for thinking that helps researchers get rid of bad ideas and zero in on the complex truth that's hidden inside specific, important historical stories.
And that brings us to one last thought. Now that you have this tool for logical elimination, what puzzle that's always fascinated you could you maybe start to unravel? Why did one ancient civilization collapse while its neighbor thrived? Why did one social movement take off while another just fizzled out? The methods are waiting for you.